How is your Latin this morning? Pretty good? Laudate you probably recognize as praise, as in to laud something, right? Some of you know that the encyclical Pope Francis wrote about care for the earth. He titled Laudate Si, praise to you. The idea being that environmental action is grounded in praise to our Creator with gratitude for the gift of life that we share with all creation and with the earth itself. Pueri, you might not recognize. It is boys, or broadly children, which makes it the perfect anthem to come between last Sunday's youth service, right? And this Sunday's celebration of gratitude. See, I left worship last Sunday grateful. Those of you who were here, didn't you leave grateful for our families and teachers and our congregation and our children and youth? If there's anything that could take the edge off the despair I'm feeling about the future, it was them, right? Those clear voices, that awareness of themselves in the world. Ben's story, oh my Lord, about standing shoulder to shoulder with friends in the face of loss. Laudate pueri. They reminded me that we shall overcome is not just a promise that we make or might take for granted. It's a commitment that we make to one another in the world. But of course, pueri is not a demographic, right? It's not all those people below a certain age. Pueri is the relationship we have with one another as children of God. And recognizing that relationship and giving thanks for it can overcome a lot of things. As Linda said, Laudate pueri is Mozart's musical reflection on Psalm 113. Praise be to God, praise, O children of God, from the rising of the sun to the setting thereof, the name of God is to be praised. And in that praise and thanksgiving, something happens. God raises the poor from the dust. That's Psalm 113. And lifts up the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and with the leaders of God's people. God gives the childless woman a home. Now, for those of you who know something of the culture of that time, right? Women who were childless could never be assured of a place. Psalm 113 says, God gives the childless woman a home, making her the joyous mother of pueri, children. In other words, the children of God are those who recognize that praise and thanksgiving is something that can overcome the distance we create between those who have and those who have not. It overcomes our ideas about who counts and who doesn't count. Praise and thanksgiving reminds us of who we are and how we relate to one another. So that famous line in 1 Thessalonians, in everything give thanks, you notice that it comes at the end of a list of instructions that begin with, live in peace with one another. And then it goes on to say that we should warn those who are the idlers, those who are wasting the gift of their lives. And cheer up the faint-hearted, support the weak. Oh, and here we go. Be patient with everyone. You read those words, right? And do not squander, this is the Phillips version. Do not squander the gift of your own lives by wasting time on all those delicious plans you have for revenge. You know what I mean? I know exactly the thing. Don't waste your time on that. Always seek what is good for each other and for all people. Rejoice always. Pray constantly because you're going to need it. And in everything, at the end of the list, and in everything, give thanks. So like Laudate Pueri, a.k.a. Psalm 113, the passage in 1 Thessalonians talks about praise and thanksgiving in the context of relationships. Because our lives depend on a web of relationships that we rarely see, that we never see without the eyes of gratitude. Well, the German Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer sat in a Nazi concentration camp, a camp that eventually took his life. He wrote, in normal life, one is not at all aware that we always receive infinitely more than we give, and that gratitude is what enriches life. This from a cell in a concentration camp. He goes on, one easily overestimates the importance of one's own acts and deeds compared with who we become only through other people. At the diaconate meeting on Thursday night, I asked folks to complete this sentence. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for fill in the blank. And by here, I don't just mean this physical place. I mean the here of this place in my life that goes beyond my own capacities to make things happen. I mean the here of whatever moment of grace I am standing in right now. I mean the here of opportunities that on my own I could never manufacture. I mean here as in the startling awareness that I am alive. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Craig Darling. And I don't mean here. I do mean here, physically here. But I mean here at all. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Les Everett. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for teachers and friends and circumstances that I could not have manufactured. And the list goes on and on and on. See, once you start making that list, it quickly becomes endless. Somehow, sitting in a concentration camp, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was able to see something that most of us miss, that we always receive infinitely more than we give, and that we have given ourselves more credit than we deserve for the life we have become only through other people. Now, sometimes in our normal lives, we do get a glimpse. Diana Butler Bass, in her book Grateful, tells the story of her little dog, Rembrandt. Rembrandt was lost on one of the 4 hottest days in the history of Memphis. That's got to be hot. Bass and her husband were devastated. They searched for him. They made calls. They hung up signs. I could not imagine, Bass writes, my beloved dog dying, starving, and alone. Through several difficult years of my own life, including graduate school, losing my job, and getting a divorce, Rembrandt had been my most faithful companion. I could not sleep. I could not stop crying. And then the phone call came. Rembrandt had been seen. Stumbling down the street, suffering from dehydration, they took him to the vet, and finally, beat up and exhausted, Rembrandt came home. Bass says that she laughed and she cried and she scolded that poor old dog while she kept saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." I was speaking to the dog, she says, to my neighbors, my husband, and God, all at the same time, All my feelings of fear and grief were overwhelmed, were overcome by a far more powerful emotion, gratitude. See, gratitude begins to create that endless list of gifts that overcomes our sense of isolation and self-sufficiency and fear about our own existence. Gratitude for our youth last Sunday overcame for a powerful few moments at least my despair about the future. According to Psalm 113 and 1 Thessalonians 5, gratitude can overcome the distances we create between ourselves and others. Diana Butler-Bass's fear and grief were overcome by gratitude for that wide web of relationships that brought her beloved dog home. But what if Rembrandt had not come home? What then? Later in her book, Bass says that she had a classmate at her Christian college who had this giant poster hanging in her bathroom for some reason, with the words of 1 Thessalonians emblazoned on it. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Honestly, Bass says, I always wanted to rip that poster off the wall. I was secretly full of fury at injustice, not only the injustice I had suffered, but the larger agonies and evils endured by people less fortunate than even my own sorry self. Telling victims to be grateful for trauma, violence, or abuse only wounds those who have suffered and empowers perpetrators. Feeling thankful might just have to wait. I have been well aware that I would be talking about gratitude as the fires in California rage on, taking lives, destroying property. I can't imagine, nor would I presume to know what Thanksgiving means for those folks. I'm thinking that feeling thankful will just have to wait. See, I think there's a timing in gratitude. And sometimes it has to wait. It's like talking with a person who is living in domestic violence and having that person be consumed by questions about forgiveness. Shouldn't I forgive? How do I forgive? What does forgiveness mean? If someone comes to me and they're living in domestic violence, questions about forgiveness will just have to wait. First, get out. Second, take back your life. Third, find people you can trust. Fourth, be grateful for those people. And then, somewhere down the road, we can start thinking about what forgiveness might look like for you. Bass says, gratitude cannot and should not be forced or faked, and it is never appropriate to cover up or deny abuse or excuse injustice. Indeed, gratitude as a placebo can be another form of abuse that silences those in deep pain with false notions of forgiveness, happiness, and well-being. Sometimes, Thanksgiving has to wait. Back in the day, there was a famous theologian who also wrote sermons. Those don't always go together. We don't know that because we're blessed with Dr. Hunter, who is a theologian who also writes sermons. But back in the day, there was another person named Paul Tillich who wrote a sermon on this very text in 1 Thessalonians 5. Give thanks in everything. And he says there are no limits to giving thanks in the whole of creation, in that wide web of relationships that has brought us here, in the whole of creation. There's no limits. But, he says, are there not limits in our own life? Can we honestly give thanks for the frustrations, accidents, and diseases that strike us? We cannot in the moment when they take hold of us. Here is one of the many situations where piety can degenerate into dishonesty. That's the price of the sermon right there. Do you know what I'm talking about? Sometimes piety just degenerates into dishonesty. Our faith makes us pretend something that is not true. For we rightly resist such evils, he says. We want to remove them. And there are depths of suffering, bodily and mental, in which even the question of thanking or not thanking does not appear. And, I believe, he says, at some time in our lives, all of us have had experiences that were nothing but evil when they happened, but that became good later, and the object of honest thanks. See, if I'm honest, when I look back now, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for that endless stream of people and forces and those seeds of goodness that were planted in some really rotten times in my life. I wouldn't be here. Gratitude is one of the ways we overcome simply writing off the past as a lost cause, or a series of failures that has predetermined the course of my future. And that's important because gratitude isn't only about where we are now or how we remember the past. It's also about how we come to imagine the future. See, if it's gratitude for our young people that helps me overcome my despair in the present, it's gratitude for some of our older folks that inspire me to imagine a future that overcomes the regret of the past. I know people, you probably do too, who come to the end of their lives with disappointments and hurt that steep into a brew of bitterness. I do not want that to be me. I want laudate pueri. I want to imagine all the ways that my life turned out to be infinitely more gifted than I had the capacity to give. I want to go out with thank you on my lips. Because in the end, as Saint Anne Lamott says, we are haunted by our failures and mortality. And yet, the world keeps on spinning. And in our grief, rage, and fear, a few people keep on loving us and showing up. Never underestimate the power of showing up. Awful stuff happens, she says, and beautiful stuff happens. And it's all part of that big picture. And in the face of everything, we slowly come through. We come to know or reconnect with something rich and okay about ourselves. And at some point, we cast our eyes to the beautiful skies above all the crap we are wallowing in, and we whisper, thank you. Thank you. That's what I want. The gratitude that overcomes regret for the past, the taken for grantedness of the present, and the bitterness of the future. And as our young people taught us last Sunday, we shall overcome is not just a promise, it's a commitment we make. So today, if you hear that voice, if you hear that whisper of thank you deep in your soul, for your sake, for the world's sake, for God's sake, do not harden